Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey. Being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 42 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to Go History, where I take you on some of the greatest real-life journeys of the past, adventures that continue to shape how we see the world today. In the true story I'm currently telling, 17-year-old German Georg Forster sails around the globe with his father, a naturalist, aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. Today's episode brings us to Matavai Bay on the island of Tahiti, one of the most storied locations in the South Pacific. After a long and challenging stretch among remote coral atolls and tense encounters with wary islanders, the crew of the Resolution has finally arrived at a place they consider almost a second home. Georg's original travel narrative, written in the elevated language of the 18th century, has been translated into modern English. His understanding of the world reflects the scientific thinking of his time. Throughout the podcast, I'll step in to offer background and modern context to help bring these observations to life. What happened in the last episode?
In the previous episode, the Resolution made a brief and difficult stop at Tahiti in the Marquesas Islands in April 1774. The hot climate and unfamiliar fruits only worsened the health of many already ill sailors, including Georg Forster himself, who fell seriously ill with gall-related symptoms, a condition poorly understood in the 18th century, and often treated with extreme methods like purging or bloodletting. Captain Cook, too, showed signs of exhaustion after relentlessly organizing supplies and caring for the crew. From there, they sailed through the treacherous waters east of the Society Islands, known in Dutch travelogues as the Evil Sea and the Labyrinth. They reached several low coral atolls, including Teeming in the King Georg Islands, where brief but tense encounters with islanders unfolded. Though initial trade was peaceful, the situation grew precarious when large armed groups emerged. The crew ultimately withdrew under rising pressure and fired warning shots as they departed. After leaving the coral atolls behind, a sense of relief swept over the crew. They were finally approaching Tahiti. They sighted the island's majestic coastline once more. Georg, still weak, climbed on deck just to glimpse the island he remembered so fondly. As the lush, green mountains and blooming plains of Matavai Bay came into view, it felt like a return to paradise. And for the sick, a long-awaited promise of rest and recovery.
Tuesday, April 19th, 1774, Tahiti.
No sooner had the islanders spotted the ship from shore than several canoes approached to welcome the newcomers with gifts of fruit. Among the first visitors on board were two young men who appeared to be of higher rank. They were invited into the cabin, where they met Maheine. Following local custom, they presented him with gifts in the form of garments made from fine native fabric. They removed their outer cloaks and handed them to him to wear. In return, Maheine showed them his collection of curiosities and gave them a few red feathers, which they regarded as precious treasures. By 8 o'clock in the morning, they had dropped anchor in Matavai Bay, whereupon a whole fleet of canoes gathered around the ship. Old acquaintances of the crew brought fish, breadfruit, apples, coconuts, and bananas for sale, offering them at very reasonable prices. The fish, among them thick-beaked species and bonitos, were displayed alive in a water container set between the twin hulls of a double canoe, sealed with a woven framework of twigs to allow the water to flow through. As during their previous stay, several tents were set up again on Point Venus to conduct astronomical observations and to facilitate trading, woodcutting, and water collection. The captain, Dr. Sparman, and Georg's father went ashore, while Georg, still too weak, had to remain on board. He used the time to trade with the islanders from the cabin window, and in this way he acquired a few new species of fish.
Point Venus on Tahiti became one of the most important scientific sites of the 18th century because it was chosen as the observation point for the transit of Venus on June 3, 1769, during James Cook's first voyage around the world. The Royal Society and the British Admiralty had sent Cook into the Pacific with a specific astronomical mission: to observe the rare celestial event in which the planet Venus passes directly across the face of the Sun. The purpose of this observation was not purely symbolic. It had crucial scientific value. By recording the exact time of the transit from different locations around the globe, astronomers hoped to calculate the distance between the Earth and the Sun with much greater accuracy than before. This astronomical unit would serve as a fundamental measurement for navigation and for understanding the scale of the solar system. Cook, accompanied by astronomer Charles Green and the naturalist Joseph Banks, set up a fortified observation camp at what later came to be called Point Venus. Despite cloudy skies and other difficulties, the team managed to complete their observations. Even though the data from around the world did not lead to the hoped-for precise calculation because of a phenomenon called the black drop effect that blurred the exact moment Venus touched the Sun's edge, the mission was still considered a scientific success. After this, Cook opened the sealed second set of instructions from the Admiralty, which ordered him to search for the unknown southern continent, Terra Australis. Thus, Point Venus marked not only a milestone in the history of astronomy, but also the true beginning of Cook's great voyages and geographic discovery.
The reports from shore sounded promising. The surroundings appeared in better condition than during their first visit. The fresh greenery shone in full splendor. Many trees still bore fruit. The streams were rich with water, and numerous new houses had been built. Maheine, who had accompanied the group ashore, did not return that night. He had immediately met several of his relatives, among them his sister Teioa, one of the most beautiful women on the island, who was married to Nuna, an influential and respected man from Raiatea. Their large house, distinguished by its exceptional size, stood barely 200 steps beyond the river, close to the crew's tents. Before going ashore, Maheine had taken off his European clothes and instead put on the splendid new garments his fellow islanders had given him. His joy clearly showed how deeply attached he was to the customs of his homeland. This was hardly surprising, since among most still uncivilized or wild peoples, the power of habit plays a strong role. For Maheine, it was only natural to prefer the simple and happy life of his people to the restlessness, unfamiliar food, and the tight, uncomfortable clothing of the European sailors. Even among the Eskimos, it had been seen how they returned with longing to their harsh homeland, to their seal skins and greasy whale oil, even after having experienced the cuisine, clothing, and splendor of Europe. In Tahiti, Maheine found all the joy and contentment he could have hoped for. Everyone treated him with remarkable respect, and, in many ways, regarded him as a true sensation. He was served the finest food, received various garments as gifts, and during his encounters with the island's women, he often had the chance to enjoy pleasures he had been deprived of at sea. As a child of nature, sensitive to every sensual delight, and long deprived of the sight of his beautiful countrymen and women, this was a welcome opportunity to satisfy his longings. His contact with the sailors may have even intensified this tendency. The pleasures he could experience on this charming island held him completely in their spell, especially through the company of his fellow islanders. The warm climate was another reason he avoided returning to the ship. Why should he retreat into a cramped, possibly foul-smelling cabin, when he could enjoy the pure air, the scent of flowers, and the pleasant cool of the evening breeze on land? As happy as Maheine was ashore, there were also some on board who considered their own situation enviable. On the very first evening, several women came aboard, and the night was spent in debauchery. It had already been observed during the previous visit that the women who engaged in such behavior generally came from the lower social classes. This was confirmed once again, as it was the same women who had previously been involved with the sailors in similar misconduct. This clearly showed that these women formed their own social group here as well. However, they were by no means numerous, and moral corruption was nowhere near as widespread as earlier visitors might have claimed. It would have been just as absurd if, for example, Omai had told his people that in England there was no virtue or decency, simply because he had not encountered such qualities among the accommodating ladies of Covent Garden, Drury Lane, and the Strand.
Omai was a Polynesian from the Society Islands who was brought to England through James Cook's second voyage around the world. There he became a social sensation and embodied the image of the noble savage, as romanticized by the European Enlightenment. Omai impressed London society with his presence and was celebrated in aristocratic circles as a symbol of an exotic, supposedly unspoiled world. His stay in England offered the British an opportunity to reflect on their own ideas of culture, civilization, and nature. In 18th century London, Covent Garden and nearby Drury Lane were notorious centers for brothels and prostitution. In these areas, prostitution was an open secret, tolerated and yet stigmatized. Brothels were occasionally shut down by the authorities, but often reopened quickly. These neighborhoods reflected the social inequality and double standards of London society, which on one hand preached moral values, while on the other accepted such places as a part of urban life.
The day after their arrival, the weather was exceptionally fine. Many of the locals came aboard to visit them. Georg tried to go ashore to the tents, but had barely walked 50 steps before he had to turn back and sit down to avoid fainting. At the spot where he sat, apples were among the goods being offered for sale. They looked so tempting that Georg, against his doctor's strict orders, took the risk and ate one. After that, he returned to the ship. During this time, the people on board had traded nails, knives, and other small items for 50 large bonitos and a great quantity of fruit, so that generous portions could be distributed to the crew. One of the Tahitian visitors on board, however, had taken the opportunity to steal some nails from the ship. When Georg returned, he found the thief in chains. Yet many respected individuals pleaded on the man's behalf and promised to provide a considerable number of bonitos in compensation if he were released. In the end, he was set free under the condition that he would refrain from such thefts in the future. The disreputable rabble that had spent the previous night on board returned again that evening, bringing even more of their kind, so that each sailor could have his own wench. This suited them perfectly, as they had been celebrating St. George's Day. In keeping with old tradition, they had drunk heartily in honor of their homeland's patron saint. When the festivities ended, they spent the entire beautiful moonlit night in the service of Cythera.
The expression services of Cythera is a poetic euphemism for acts of love or sexual services, often framed in a romantic or sensual context. It refers to Cythera, a Greek island closely associated in ancient mythology with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and sensuality. Cythera was considered a mythical place of amorous pleasures, and Aphrodite was especially venerated there. In the literature and poetry of the 17th and 18th century, the term was used to elegantly or metaphorically describe love affairs, seductions, or even prostitution, without speaking openly or bluntly about sexuality. The services of Cythera thus became a culturally charged expression that could imply both romantic and transactional love. Especially during times when direct language was considered inappropriate, this kind of phrasing allowed for allusions to erotic themes without violating social taboos.
Dr. Sparman and Georg's father didn't return on board from the countryside until after sunset. They had walked across One Tree Hill to Pare, where they met Tutaha's mother and Hapai, the king's father, and greeted both with gifts. A local man who accompanied them from there proved to be of great help, especially by swimming far into a pond to retrieve some wild ducks they had shot. He also invited them to his hut, located about 10 miles west of Point Venus. There, he served them a meal of fruit and an excellent pudding made from grated coconut and arrowroot. In addition, he provided them generously with coconuts, which the trees around his hut produced in abundance. After the meal, he gave them a fragrant garment made of fine cloth and carried a large amount of leftover fruit for them on their way back. On the way, they spotted the 2 goats Captain Fourneau had given to the king, not far from their new owner's house. During their absence, the goats had grown a fine, soft, silky coat, and the female had already given birth to 2 kids. These were nearly fully grown, well-fed, and just as lively as their parents. If the locals continued to care for these animals so attentively, they would soon be able to let them roam freely, and their rapid reproduction would offer a welcome new source of food. The father's hospitable companion came aboard with them, spent the night there, and returned home the next morning, delighted with the knives, nails, and glass beads he had received in return.
Sunday, April 24th, 1774, Tahiti.
In the morning, they felt remarkably refreshed from the apple they had eaten the day before, despite the doctor's orders against it. Even Captain Cook, who was still showing signs of his bilious condition, experienced a similar effect from the fruit. They therefore continued to enjoy it freely and recommended it to all patients with similar ailments. The improvement was unexpectedly rapid, and within a few days the illness had been entirely overcome, save for a slight, lingering weakness. Around midday, despite a rain shower that had just ended, King Tu came to visit them, accompanied by his sister Taurai and his brother. They brought Captain Cook a gift of several pigs. The king was noticeably less wary and reserved than during their earlier meeting. In return for his generosity, he received a pair of hatchets. However, he and his entourage seemed particularly interested in red parrot feathers, which they called ura. Without a doubt, Maheine's stories and the gifts of such feathers he had already distributed had prompted the king to ask for them. They searched through their entire stock of items brought from the Friendly Islands and found a good number of these feathers. Still, they didn't consider it wise to show everything at once. Instead, they presented only a small portion of these prized items to the king and his sister. Even this modest display filled them with delighted astonishment. The feathers were attached either to bark cloth or to star-shaped frames made of coconut fiber. They gave the high-ranking guests a small piece of the decorated cloth, no wider than 2 fingers, along with 1 or 2 of the feathered stars. Although the gift was modest in size, it was clearly more than they had expected, and they left highly pleased. These feathers were primarily used to decorate war garments, though no doubt they were also worn on other ceremonial occasions. The extraordinarily high value placed on them was a clear sign of the advanced level of luxury among these people. The day after their arrival, several of the island's chiefs visited the ship, including their old friend Potatau, along with his 2 wives, Wenyo and Politehera. They too seemed to have heard of the abundance of red feathers aboard, for they brought many pigs, eager to trade even for the smallest bits of the sought-after featherwork. It was striking how much the condition of the inhabitants had improved since their 8-month absence. On their first visit, they had struggled to obtain even a few pigs, and these were considered special favors, usually from King Tu or other high-ranking individuals. Now, however, the ship's decks were so crowded with pigs that they had to build a dedicated pen for the animals on shore. These changes showed that the people had fully recovered from their last unfortunate war with the other half of the island, the effects of which had still weighed heavily on them during the first visit in August 1773. Throughout the morning, rain and thunderstorms continued. The lightning was so intense that, for safety, they attached a copper chain to the top of the mainmast and let it hang overboard. When a sailor released the lower end of the chain, caught in the rigging, and let it fall into the water, a massive bolt of lightning shot down along the chain. A terrifying clap of thunder followed immediately, and the entire ship trembled. Everyone on board, including the Tahitians, was deeply shaken. Yet the lightning caused no damage, once again proving the effectiveness of the electrical chain, which Captain Cook had already tested on the Endeavour in Batavia. The rain didn't let up until evening, and by the next morning it had stopped entirely. The first news from shore, however, reported a theft, Several of the captain's jackets and wool blankets, which had been taken out of the tents to be washed, had been stolen. Captain Cook went ashore with Dr. Sparman, Georg's father, and several others to ask the king to intervene. Georg, now somewhat recovered, was able to go with them. Upon arriving at the coast of Opare, they were surprised by an unexpected scene. A large fleet of war canoes lay anchored along the shore, manned by rowers and warriors in full armor, equipped with breastplates and tall helmets. The beach was crowded with people, but a solemn silence prevailed. As soon as they reached land, T, a cousin of the king, came forward to escort Captain Cook inland. But at the same time, the fleet's admiral, Toha, stepped ashore and greeted them politely. As Toha approached, the crowd called out his name with reverence and made way for him. He went straight to Captain Cook, shook his hand, and called him his friend. He invited him to step aboard his canoe. Tia appeared displeased by this, but they followed Toha to his vessel. Just as Captain Cook was about to board, however, he changed his mind and declined the invitation. Toha clearly felt offended and withdrew coldly, while the others continued inspecting the impressive fleet. The ships were lined up neatly with their bows facing the shore, and their size and construction surpassed anything they had previously imagined about Tahiti's strength and wealth. No fewer than 159 large double-war canoes, ranging from 15 to 27 meters in length, had assembled here. Considering how rudimentary the tools of the islanders were, one could only marvel at the patience required to construct such vessels. To fell the necessary trees, cut planks, smooth them, and join them into sturdy, seaworthy ships, they used nothing more than a stone adze and chisel, a piece of coral, and coarse stingray skin, the latter primarily for smoothing surfaces. All the canoes were double-hulled, each pair connected by 15 to 18 strong crossbeams. These beams were spaced about 1.4 meters apart and ranged from 3.6 to 7.3 meters in length. The longer beams extended well beyond the sides of the canoes, forming a kind of platform or deck, often between 15 and 21 meters long. To reinforce the crossbeams, they secured 2 or 3 longitudinal spars to the outer sides and the middle between the two hulls. The bow and stern of the canoes extended several meters above the water, with the stern sometimes reaching up to 6 meters in height. It curved upward like a beak and was often elaborately carved. Between the high sterns of the double canoes, a piece of white cloth was usually stretched, which caught the wind like a sail. Some canoes also displayed striped pennants with red panels, serving as identification for the various fleet divisions. Atop the beak-shaped stern, a carved post often stood, the topmost part of which represented a crooked human figure. The faces of these figures were sometimes hidden behind a wooden frame, resembling a lowered hat, or painted with red ochre. The posts were often decorated with tufts of black feathers, with long strands of strung feathers hanging down from them. The sides of the canoes rose about 60 to 90 centimeters above the water, though construction varied. Some had flat bottoms with vertical sides, while others were rounded with a sharp keel, as already documented during Captain Cook's first voyage. Toward the front of the canoes, platforms for warriors were built on posts 4 to 6 feet high, often adorned with carvings. These platforms extended far beyond the hulls, about 6 to 7 meters in length and 2 to 3 meters wide. Beneath them was a flat deck made of crossbeams and longitudinal spars. The crisscrossed arrangement of these beams created rectangular gaps in which the rowers sat. Canoes with 18 crossbeams and 3 longitudinal spars could accommodate 144 rowers, along with 8 steersmen, 4 positioned at each stern. Most canoes, however, had no overhanging platforms, so the rowers sat directly inside the hull. The warriors stood on the raised structures, and each canoe held about 15 to 20 fighters. Their clothing was striking and created an impressive spectacle. They wore 3 layers of cloth. The longest, innermost layer was white, the middle red, and the shortest outer layer was brown. Their breastplates were woven and decorated with feathers and shark teeth. While nearly every warrior wore such a breastplate, helmets were rare. The helmets were extraordinarily large, nearly 1.5 meters high, and made from long cylindrical woven structures with reinforced front plates. These plates, covered in shiny blue-green pigeon feathers and framed with white feathers, gave off a radiant aura from afar. Long tail feathers from the tropic bird fanned downward, giving the warriors a majestic appearance. The helmets were worn atop a large cloth turban to help distribute the weight, and served more for display than for protection. The highest-ranking commanders also wore long feathered fans on their backs, resembling Turkish horsetails. Toha, the admiral, wore 5 of these, along with coconut fiber cords, adorned with red feather tufts. The fleet of 159 large double-hulled war canoes lay in a single line. Each canoe was armed with spears, clubs, and large stones, the latter being their only ranged weapon. Beyond the main formation, 70 smaller canoes, mostly double-hulled and roofed, served as quarters or supply vessels for commanders. Some of these were loaded with banana leaves, which the islanders said were meant for burials. They called these canoes E1-E42, boats of the deity. The fleet's manpower was impressive. An estimated 1,500 warriors and 4,000 rowers manned the canoes, not counting those aboard the supply vessels or the people on shore. They would have gladly learned the purpose of this great assembly, but at first no clear information was available. As the king had left the district of Opara and gone to Matavai Bay, they returned on board around midday without speaking to him. There, they found many chiefs already waiting, among them Potatau, who dined with them and explained that the entire fleet was preparing for an expedition against the island of Eimeo. The commander of that island, a vassal of O2, had reportedly rebelled against the king. To their even greater surprise, they learned that the fleet they had seen represented only the contingent from the district of Atahuru. All other districts were able to launch a proportional number of ships according to their size. This gave them a new perspective on the true population of the island and convinced them that it must be far greater than they had previously assumed. By moderate estimate, the 2 peninsulas of Tahiti must be home to at least 120,000 people, and even that number might be too low. Later, they observed that the fleet from the smallest district consisted of no fewer than 44 war canoes and 20 to 25 smaller vessels. From this, they concluded that the Atahuru contingent on which they had based their calculations could not have been complete. The 2 peninsulas were divided into 43 districts. Assuming that each district could equip an average of 20 war canoes, each manned by 35 men, the full fleet's manpower, excluding the accompanying small boats, would amount to at least 30,000 men. That number could represent roughly 1/4 of the total population. Even this calculation was very conservative, as it assumed that there were no additional able-bodied men on the island, which was unlikely. Moreover, they estimated the ratio of able-bodied to unfit individuals at 1:4, whereas in European countries the number of unfit typically far exceeded that of those fit for service. In the afternoon, Captain Cook once again went ashore at Opare with them, but the fleet had already departed, and the canoes had dispersed. Instead, they encountered King O2, who received them warmly. He led them to several of his houses, along a path that passed through a landscape resembling a well-kept garden. Shady fruit trees, fragrant flowering bushes, and crystal-clear streams alternated in this idyllic area. The houses were in excellent order. Some had walls made of reed, while others, like the homes of commoners, were open on all sides. They spent several hours in the company of the king, whose relatives and highest attendants made efforts to show their friendship. Although the conversation lacked coherence, it remained lively. The women in particular were cheerful, joking, and entertaining them with puns and witty remarks. The afternoon passed so quickly that they did not return to the ship until sunset. They had experienced a glimpse of the happiness that nature had bestowed upon the people of this island. The calm and contentment of these inhabitants, their simple way of life, the beauty of the landscape, the excellent climate, and the abundance of delicious fruit were enchanting and filled them with joy. The next morning, Captain Cook and Georg's father paid another visit to the king in Pare. There, they met Toha, the admiral of the fleet, whom the king personally introduced to them. Captain Cook invited both of them to visit the ship, which they did later that morning. Toha, who had never before been aboard a European vessel, observed everything with great attention, particularly the strength and size of the interior beams, masts, and ropes. He was so impressed by the rigging that he asked for some ropes and an anchor. Toha was simply dressed this time, naked from the waist down, probably out of deference to the presence of the king. Still, his demeanor remained noble and dignified. During the shared meal, both the king and the admiral showed a hearty appetite and were in high spirits. The king demonstrated to Toha how to use salt on meat and how to drink wine, jokingly trying to convince him that red wine was blood. Toha tasted grog and soon asked for pure brandy, which he called British water. In conversation, they confirmed that the fleet was indeed intended for an expedition against the rebels on Eimeo, also known as York Island. The first attack was to be launched in the district of Morea. Captain Cook jokingly offered to accompany them with his ship and support the landing with cannon fire. At first, they laughed and accepted the offer, but later they politely declined. They said they would not depart for Eimeo until 5 days after their return. Their caution was understandable. After all, even their allies must have had some degree of respect for the Europeans' superior firepower. The people of Eimeo had attributed their earlier defeat entirely to European artillery, while the victorious Tahitians had lost status after the Europeans left.
That brings us to the end of episode 42 of Georg Forster's journey around the world aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. Today's episode ends in Matavai Bay, Tahiti, where the crew, exhausted, ill, and hopeful, has finally returned after 8 long months at sea. For Georg and his companions, Tahiti is more than just a familiar place. It's a symbol of rest, healing, and renewed curiosity. A map with the key locations from this episode is linked in the show notes. If you'd like to see how these places look today, visit my YouTube channel, Voyage to Go, where I trace Forster's journey and explore the echoes of history in the present day. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of our expedition. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support my work, you'll find the PayPal link in the show notes. The journey continues, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.